Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Carlos Eire, the T. Lawrison Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. He specializes in the social, intellectual, religious, and cultural history of late medieval and early modern Europe, with a strong focus on both the Protestant and Catholic Reformations, the history of popular piety, and the history of death. Professor Eire is the author of a number of scholarly books, including War Against the Idols, The Reformation of Worship from Erasmus to Calvin, From Madrid to Purgatory, The Art and Craft of Dying in 16th Century Spain, and A Very Brief History of Eternity. He has also ventured into the 20th century and the Cuban Revolution in his memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana, which won the National Book Award in Nonfiction in 2003 and has been translated into more than a dozen languages, but alas is banned in Cuba. His latest memoir, Learning to Die in Miami, published in 2010, explores his boyhood exile experience. Today we'll talk with Professor Eire about what it's like to write two very different kinds of history, one kind through research and the other from memory. Welcome, Professor Eire.
Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this program.
Let's start with talking about your memoirs and give us a little bit of an overview of them and then how they fit together.
Yeah, well, the first memoir, which I wrote in 2000, covers my childhood in Cuba, from my earliest memories to the day I leave. That's when the book ends, the day I left Cuba, April 6, 1962. Learning to Die in Miami picks up immediately that evening when I arrive in the United States and goes through up to about 1965 or so when I reunite with my mother, because I left without my parents.
Right.
So that's the bookends of that story, is leaving my parents and then reuniting with my mother.
Okay, and you write very scholarly publications. And I'm wondering how it is different for you writing the memoirs versus doing your scholarly research.
Well, I love both, but I have to say that if I were to compare the two, the scholarly research is like climbing a very steep mountain with a 75-pound backpack. The memoirs are a walk through the park.
Really?
Because they require no research. I wrote the first memoir in 3 months. I wrote the second memoir in 2 months. My scholarly books take me about an average of 10 years apiece.
Wow, that is very different.
It's very different. I can write really fast because all the research is strictly up here. I looked up nothing for either memoir except for one thing. I looked up one fact just out of curiosity, which was how many men had landed at the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Okay.
It's for my own curiosity, not because it made any difference to the story.
Okay. I admire people who can remember their childhood with such, detail and accuracy. Unfortunately, I don't have that talent, so I don't know if I'll ever be able to write my own memoir.
Well, I don't think it's a talent. I think circumstances have a lot to do with it.
Really?
In my case, I left abruptly. I left without my parents, and I have never been back. So all of that is kind of like an item inside a snow globe for me. It's preserved.
Right.
Every time I see film or photos from present-day Cuba, I get thrown for a loop because my memories are messed with.
Right. Sure.
My memories are kind of pristine because I've never gone back, and I think that has a lot to do with it.
And how old were you again when you were airlifted out?
11.
11. That must have been, my daughter is 11, that must have been a terrifying moment for you.
It wasn't terrifying. It was exhilarating because I was so desperate to leave. The place was so horrible. As a child, right, and your parents tell you constantly, everything will be fine, we'll be together again. You believe your parents at that age.
Sure.
So, yes, there was an element of fear, but it wasn't terrifying.
Right. I'm wondering how you ended up doing the scholarly work you currently do. Was it born out of your experience in Cuba? What led you to do the work that you do?
It's a combination of things. For one thing, my father was immensely interested in the past, and he collected antiques. So in our household, the past was always more important than the present. I think that had a lot to do with it. But the turning point for me came very early. First inkling that I wanted to be a historian was when I was living in a foster home for juvenile delinquents in Miami. And the only place where I could escape was a public library. I went there every evening and spent 2-3 hours there and gravitated to the history section. And pretty soon I had gone through all of the children's section and was given permission to check out some of the adult history books. And that's when I can identify I got hooked. Of course, at that point, I didn't think I wanted to be a professor because I didn't even know what a professor did. So I can't trace it exactly to that, but that's a moment where I can say with clarity, that's when I got hooked on history, on the past.
But you write predominantly about religious history, correct? Yes. So let's talk a little bit about the work you're doing now. I'm particularly interested in the levitation and the shift in attitudes towards miracles.
Right, because I work in the area of the transition from medieval to modern, right? And what distinguishes modern from medieval? What is modern? Well, in modern, there's a mind shift away from the miraculous, but only at the upper levels of the intelligentsia. Right?
And when you say modern, what year
Let's
year
say
span are we talking?
Invention of the printing press, 1450, changes learning completely.
Okay.
So from 1450 on, there are individuals who begin to back away from medieval beliefs in miracles, and steadily becomes more and more acceptable among the intelligentsia, and especially among Protestants, to say that miracles have not happened since biblical times. What I study is the messy part. I study not only the continuation of medieval attitudes, but among Catholics, the embrace of those attitudes and the exaggeration of those attitudes. So a subtitle for my project is A History of the Impossible. I look at miracles that we in our day and age deem totally impossible, such as levitation or bilocation, being in two places at the same. So that these are miracles that are not healing miracles over which there are always question marks. Was it natural? Was it a miracle? But if you have accounts and hundreds of witnesses who say so-and-so was 10 feet off the ground, then as a historian, you've got a problem.
And how do you deal with something like that?
Well, I say that we bring really big brackets to put around the problem, where we don't ask the question, did so-and-so really levitate 10 feet off the ground? But the question becomes, what can we make of these testimonies? How do you explain this?
And how do you explain it?
It's hard. It's very hard. And occasionally I struggle with this because at one talk when I was going on and on in detail about history of the impossible, someone raised their hand and said, "Excuse me, you're not dealing with the history of the impossible, you're dealing with the history of the ridiculous." Well, that's the danger. It's very thin ice that you go out on when you start putting these things strictly in context and saying that you can't really go much deeper than the belief that people were perhaps convinced they saw this. And the question mark remains over the event. But as a cultural historian or as a social historian, one can approach these miracles and try to figure out what they tell us about the transition to modernity and how complex it was.
Right.
And, it's not like the belief in these miracles has gone away. It has not. It is still part of Western culture. It's not just as big a part, but it's still a live wire for many people. So, in a way, analyzing this in the 16th or 17th century is also a way of shedding light on something as part of our culture here and now, today.
So what were some of the reasons why there is perhaps a shift away from the belief in miracles in modern times?
For one thing, the Protestant Reformation has a lot to do with it. Although the Protestant Reformation is informed by many trends from the previous century. But the fact that the Catholic Church claimed that all of these miracles happened, and the fact that the Church argued that the fact that it was genuine, that it was the real thing, that it was the one true Church, could be proved through these miracles, made Protestants back away from these, right? And say, no, this doesn't prove anything. In fact, what this proves is that you're constantly tricking people. And so it becomes a polemical issue.
Right.
There's also, in Protestant theology, at the most rarefied upper levels, if you want to deal just with the theology, they have a different take on how it is that God interacts with the world. So it becomes a theological and philosophical question for Protestant theologians. How do spirit and matter relate to one another? How does the natural relate to the supernatural? And they go from there. And like, for instance, in Catholic ritual, there is no ritual more central than the celebration of the Eucharist, the Mass, and the Catholic belief in transubstantiation, which is that the bread and wine become something other than bread and wine, right? Protestants had enormous difficulties accepting this for theological reasons, as well as for polemical reasons. And all of this hangs together. And to say people can float 10 feet off the ground when they're praying, there's a whole long list of, I could name possibly over 100 theological items, topics, that are touched on by making simply that claim.
So let me ask you this. As a matter of course, scholars build on other scholars' work. Now you have your scholarly work that you've done and, of course, your memoirs. Is there any difference for you if someone uses your scholarly work versus uses your memoirs as a part of their scholarly work? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I haven't seen too much of the latter, right? Yeah, it does happen. Once I was visiting University of North Carolina, and someone ran into me, and I was introduced, and they said, "Oh, I teach your book." And I knew immediately which book it was that they were teaching, because she was from the Spanish department, right? So it's very different. I've been to 2 literature conferences where I've been featured, and it's very different. It's totally different, because I feel that the writing from memory is simply because it doesn't have all that work behind it, right? It's not that I don't take it seriously, but I have a hard time thinking of it as being the same as my scholarly work. But a great, huge, enormous difference is that I have received thousands of emails and letters thanking me for my memoirs. I've only received 3 letters in my entire lifetime thanking me for my scholarship.
Yes, well, I'm sure that's understandable. But I mean, it's your memoirs are, it's so personal to you.
Yeah. Right.
So it's like it's letting other people really have a microscope into who you are. So that's why I asked that question.
The reason I wrote them, though, was not so much to talk about myself, but to write about the history of the Cuban Revolution in a way that would be interesting for people, that they could get at. Because one thing I know as a historian is that first-person narrative gets you to the past more directly than anything else.
Exactly.
So that was my sneaky plan when I began to write the first memoir. Because I was very upset and irritated by years and years and years and years of people not only asking me what I thought were very dumb questions about Cuba, but actually very intelligent, very well-educated people displaying abysmal ignorance about Cuba.
Right.
So the professor in me basically couldn't take anymore. But the professor somehow had to strangle himself and leave out analysis and have nothing but narrative.
Right.
And it worked, I think. I think it actually, from the letters and emails I've received, people thank me not for telling my story.
Right.
They thank me for enlightening them about what happened in Cuba, or actually about 1/3 of the letters I receive are from Cuban exiles, because my book is banned in Cuba, so nobody there reads it.
Right.
Cuban exiles who actually very interestingly say, thank you for telling my story. Right? So I shuddered when I thought of this book being read by Cubans, because Cubans can be hypercritical of each other and hypercritical about the way one deals with Cuban history. So that has been a very pleasant surprise, that actually, my story matches up in the minds of those who have been through
The same experience.
the same experience.
Right.
Yeah.
So will there be a third memoir?
The first two were unplanned. They just happened. They're personal elements, things that were going on in my life that came together that inspired me. I don't have that. Plus, a third one, I don't know what I would write about, because it's my life as an academic, which I think most people would find immensely boring. So
Maybe not.
maybe not, but I don't see it. I don't see it at this point.
Well, thank you so much for being here with
Okay.
us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you. Thank you.
For more information about Professor Eire, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.